Hi, my name is Bruno. I'm from the technical education team at the Web3 Foundation, and I'm ready to reimagine 2020.
So hey, it's Patrick McLain here. I'm one of the hosts of Reimagine 2020. I am sitting here with Bruno Skvorc. He might kill me for butchering that. Bruno is part of the education team at Web3, and definitely happy to be sitting here with him. I think you guys are going to enjoy this conversation. Bruno, do you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. So I'm a technical educator at the Web3 Foundation right now, and that, as you might know, is the organization behind the upcoming Polkadot network that's launching soon. Previously, I was a web developer before I transitioned to Ethereum full-time in 2015. I've worked on Ethereum 2.0 for a while at the Stateless company, and then transitioned to Web3, where I now basically teach people how to use our technology, come up with proofs of concept that basically intrigue other developers to develop on our technology, and explain what we've developed or researched to people who might not be familiar with the technology. So that's basically the technical education part there. Also, we maintain the wiki, which is the most comprehensive resource about all of this that you can possibly read, so I highly recommend it.
Got it. Yeah, and obviously education is important to us. You know, as you and I were talking about before we started this call, right? Our group and kind of the people throwing this comments have always believed in education. When we look at blockchain, it's very hard to get to the next hurdles, right? I think some people are under the assumption that this technology is easy to build. We kind of take a view that it's not, right? It's not going to come overnight. And anyone that, you know, you can go to many chat rooms or blogs that they jump on the new bandwagon, or they think the old guard is horrible. We tend to believe that there's a lot of work that's going to need to go in the next decade to really support it. So definitely interesting to get your perspective throughout this conversation. Is it safe to say, would you describe yourself as pretty technical? Like on a scale of 1 to 10, you'd give yourself a...
Yeah, I'd go for an 8 or 9, I guess.
8 or 9. So you're very technical, right?
Yeah.
So, and you mentioned a little bit earlier, you know, you're a web developer, and obviously your past experiences kind of led you at some point to blockchain. Do you mind talking about that a bit? Like what did that look like in your past that kind of led you to now?
Yeah, sure. So I was doing web development because I always wanted to develop things, and it was just the quickest way to ship things. And I was never interested in the low-level things because it just took too long. So I was always chasing that fast high of being able to ship something overnight and develop prototypes really, really rapidly. I actually started as a Flash developer, as an ActionScript dev way back in 2010 or something, because this company needed me to build them a PDF reader in Flash, and that's where I got interested in all of this stuff. But it was always the ship fast thing that drew me in there. I had heard of Bitcoin before, but it wasn't really impressive to me. So I kind of ignored it until 2015, when I actually needed to buy some to invest in Ethereum. And Ethereum grabbed my attention because the story it told kind of resonated. I'm from Croatia, and like just 30 years ago, the only source of information my parents had was a state-sanctioned TV, state-sanctioned radio, and state-sanctioned newspaper, basically. With no internet, with no widespread internet like it is today, there was really no way for them to get up-to-date information on you know, like global things. And I've seen that trend reemerge after the various crises that gripped the world in the early 2010s, and I saw different countries unexpectedly fall into some sort of chaos, whether it was riots due to some economic strife or hyperinflation. Things started developing there that didn't really feel good. But I also noticed that there were some governments that were very bent on silencing, like, just generally conversations about things that didn't like elections were getting silenced in Iran, suddenly communication channels disappeared. So that's where my passion for the ability to send a message anywhere to anyone at any time came from. So that's why I entered the blockchain space, because I saw that as kind of an opportunity to look, like a message can be a transaction, like finance, it can be just a hello, or it can be a piece of content that somebody doesn't want you to see, like the Chinese firewall blocks. So just the ability to send and receive messages anywhere at any time from anyone to anyone without being censorable, without being stoppable, that kind of drove me to Ethereum. And that's when I started developing these educational resources for Ethereum, basically, and what kept me enthralled all these years.
Got it. So when you talk about educational resources specifically, how do you view the current talent pool in blockchain? Like, what would you say, like, the state of the talent pool is, and how are we doing attracting new talent?
Well, when I started as I was coming from the Web 2.0 world, I noticed that all of my peers in the Web 2.0 world were absolutely clueless about how to even get started with blockchain. So that was my first foray into education, getting Web 2.0 devs to understand what the advantages of the system are, or at least how to easily build on this system. And it was not easy to build on this system back then. The problem was, and still is in a large degree, that there's just no use case that would convince these developers that they need the blockchain. And that's why they don't even bother getting over this hump. You can very often see Web 2.0 developers willing to spend days trying to configure the newest JavaScript package manager and framework to work so that they can finally get their new static website built and hosted on Amazon. But they will not spend 3 or 4 hours getting familiar with the basics of blockchain technology and how to deploy a decentralized website on IPFS and verify submissions to that website on Ethereum smart contract, for example, because they just don't see this need. And when they do see this need, it's often already too late. It's a big problem that we can only defeat if we dramatically improve the user experience and the developer experience of these tools that are at our disposal. So Solidity, the smart contract language on Ethereum, just recently got the ability to give you proper output messages for failed transactions, and that's something that's just unexplainable to a Web 2.0 developer who can put breakpoints at any point in the code and find out exactly what's going on. We need to dramatically improve the developer experience because the usage examples that we have out there are not appealing enough to the standard developer who's used to deploying on cloud and Kubernetes, on Docker machines across Amazon Web Services and so on. So the appeal is just not there. So we have to make the ease of use the primary driver there, I think.
Got it. So, and I think that kind of leads me to one of my next questions that I have for you, which I think is very relevant to like what you just brought up. And again, as we were talking earlier, you might not have known, our team has had developers for a long time. So I've kind of watched that. I'm a bit technical, but I'm not the one in the trenches every day now. So I know enough about it. And if I go back 2.5 years ago, I was watching, it's kind of the question, like, why isn't there blockchain developers, right? And I almost started writing out on a piece of paper, okay, if I'm a kid getting out of college, what is my dream job? I'm a CS major, data science, and I'm an engineer, and I'm getting out of college. What's my dream job, right? Maybe today my dream job is Google or Facebook or Amazon, et cetera, right? And you say, okay, what are the metrics that are kind of define success for these jobs, right? So it would be making faster applications, right? Shaving milliseconds off of time, finding ways to be profitable, right? Or to benefit off of user data, right? Or monetize user data, right? So you kind of go down this list and then you compare it to blockchain and it kind of, and I'm missing a few, but it kind of like blockchain applications are not always going to be the fastest, right? Like by inherently, they're designed maybe to be a little slower, yet decentralized, and they have other benefits, right? Maybe in some cases less easy to monetize, right? As user data is obfuscated, et cetera. so it kind of came down to what would the perks be, like what would the driver be for an engineer to really get, because if it wasn't money, right? If it wasn't, I guess if you go back to like early to mid 2018, there was such a shortage of blockchain developers that I think in enough money around that people could have gotten paid anything, right? Like a lot of Silicon Valley elite could have jumped ship and made, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 that year. But you weren't seeing this migration, right? And I've kind of floated in that world enough to know it. So the last point I could get to was, it was almost morals, right? To a certain extent. I mean, you could in the traditional way that people were thinking of applications, it didn't really check many of the boxes. But it's if you wanted a decentralized world, if you wanted a world where maybe your kids 20 years from now weren't beholden to companies owning their data, et cetera, these would end up being the benefits, right? So I'd always kind of seen it as something that it wasn't going to happen overnight, right? And it wasn't super easy to quantify, right, to them on the front end. So on one half, I kind of see that there's just this general, either developers are for the cause or not for the cause, right? And then most people are probably for their bank accounts and for like they start having kids and right, they have bigger things to worry about. So we're probably not going to solve this on the phone call, but we'd like to hear your thoughts. But on the other side that you brought up, how do we make it easier for developers, right? So I know, again, if you go back to 2017, 2018, like logging was a big issue, right? Just general development tools that people had available in almost every other technology stack was not available in blockchain. And probably because it was happening so quickly, you could say. And, so I guess, how have we done the last maybe 2 years, right? And maybe the last 6 months, what do you see there? Are we really building things for developers? What are the roadblocks? Things like Infura that allow people to quickly, spin things up without having to host entire nodes. Where are we at, and where do you kind of see it going? What are some things you think the community could do to help?
Well, there are two aspects to this that you talked about just now about developers getting into blockchain. So one is definitely the morals of it all, and how developers, like in the height of it in 2017, everybody saw it. Like even most of the people who were in the industry saw it as a bubble. And a lot of people were afraid to get in because they knew it would burst. If you quit your, lower end 6-figure job to work for $300K for that year for a blockchain company, there's a high chance that company is not going to exist the next year. And then you might have burned a bridge that was really comfortable and good. So there were a lot of people who were afraid of this temporary just speed flash of like this fast burn of this industry. But the other aspect is that we actually, we don't have many developers coming in because it cannot be easy. In 2017, in order to be a blockchain developer, everybody and their dog called themselves a blockchain developer in 2017 because all you did was launch ICOs. But then what happened was we actually got real blockchain developers working on important stuff. And I've worked, like in the past few years, I've worked with more than a few 10x developers, the mythical 10x developers in some of these teams. And the way I see is the people that work on this stuff, especially at the Web3 Foundation, when I compare this output of code at parity that they're producing, that is a scary amount of really magical code. That's something that is not easy to accomplish, that level of expertise. So most people are just not capable of doing both of those things, both shifting their mindset to the blockchain.
Do you mind elaborating a little bit, like when you call it magical code, like what do you think is magical about it? I mean, and not everybody watching this might be technical, so as layman as possible.
Yeah, sure. So what I mean is the amount and quality at the same time that immediately get applied to a live network and don't break things. So this is 50 developers working on the code base of a blockchain that's running and that's real, that has real economical value. They make these updates that are gargantuan in size, so hundreds of lines of code at a time, and they all are intimately aware of each other's work. They all verify it, and when they commit it to the blockchain and upload it. And when it gets voted in, because there's a system for changing the code of the blockchain on the chain itself. So when it's voted in and applied, it works like almost flawlessly every time. So it's you have to have a certain mindset there. It's not just the skill; it's also the mental resolve to be comfortable with the fact that if you make a really big mistake, you cost a lot of people a lot of money. And that's not something that you learn as a skill. That's not something you can learn in a book or through experience that you will just, practice and then you'll get used to losing people's money. You have to be comfortable with the fact that you are either the best in the industry, like among the very best in the industry, and this won't happen to you. Or if it does, it means that it would have happened to all of the other best people there, and it's going to be understandable. So it's a mental barrier as much as a skill or demand barrier.
I've always actually been intrigued, like what you were just mentioning, the tools that allow people to kind of collaborate on code remotely, right, in a unified way. So we can call it Git repositories, etc. But actually the same principles that kind of apply to Git repositories, etc., that kind of transpose over to blockchain, right? It's in a lot of ways, it's a decentralized system where people are suggesting many changes. There's a master of truth or a master of validation. So I've always kind of laughed at those connections, but I think it's understated for people that haven't worked in a team of devs, right? You can have a team of developers that are just sending code in a Dropbox folder, right? And then you kind of transpose to a world where everybody is, committing code, doing pull requests, QAing it, right? And in kind of a harmony where nothing gets pushed to the master branch without a certain level of validation, right? And especially on projects that are so public, right? That's how people kind of make their name, where it's, if you make a big mistake, you can never hide from it, right? Like you're glued to it for eternity. Now, this is not to say that other people aren't. Hindsight's 2020. Like everyone else could QA it, look at it, never see an issue, then you might still get blamed if you're the one that wrote it, even if they couldn't find it themselves. But are there any other tools you think that really are detrimental to kind of the growth here? I mean, and I'll just give you an example. Like when we think about hackathons, right? It's what are the barriers you lower to just allow anyone at a hackathon to spin up quickly without having to do a lot of headache, or someone writing an application, right? Like what are these barriers being dropped on a daily basis that kind of lead to faster adoption?
Yeah, so that's like I personally don't favor React.js, and I don't use it. I don't like it. But the fact remains that it has dramatically lowered the barrier to entry, especially on hackathons, because almost every template these days that you can start from is based on React. So templates in general are the godsend for hackathons, because people can just start focusing on the logic of their product. The other thing is stuff like you mentioned, Infura. Well, Infura is indeed kind of harmful for the decentralization of an ecosystem. It is extremely, extremely practical for hackathons because you don't need a local node and you don't need to bother with it. That does have its downsides in the real world, because that convenience from a hackathon can transfer itself to production in way too many cases. But it's something that, for example, like at the Web3 Foundation, we've worked on really hard to build templates that kind of keep this decentralization ethos alive. We have these virtual machine playgrounds online that you can get started with. We have node templates for actual blockchain nodes that you can download and run on your computer. You're up and running with a system that works, that's ready to be deployed to other computers, even with a sample blockchain, in under an hour, and you can just focus on your logic. So I think the tools that we need to work on more are by far the templates and getting started packages, and on the other hand, documentation on how to implement everything that people have implemented before or could implement. So examples of that, so that people could reverse engineer and get to work on. One of the stellar examples that I'm also very I was also very sad to find out that it was like basically shut down, but actually passed on to another company, was the Crypto Zombies tutorial from Loom Network, and that was one of the greatest entry points for new Solidity developers who wanted to start building their CryptoKitties clones. It explained everything from random attribute generation to trading cards and smart contracts to various collectible tokens and so on hands-on examples that you would actually deploy and end up with a usable result. And that's the stuff we need. We need interactive education. We need interactive tutorials. We need in-depth recipes. And I think we're actually doing a great job at it. The bear market has shaken out all of these speculating types and the ICO developers. And now all that's left are either the experts who are building the low-level infrastructure, or the experts who are building the high-level stuff, the tools, documentation, and everything that helps the level, like the level 0 developers or the protocol developers, the chain developers, the engine developers, and then there's the level 1 developers who are building the user land-facing stuff, so the dApps, the UIs, and so on.
Got it. By the way, I think a hurricane just tried around my house, so if anybody can hear that, I apologize. I really enjoyed this conversation. These are things that I think we've thought about for a long time and kind of interest us. I have one more question around this part, and then I think there's a few other points that we should hit on. One thing that I'm curious your thoughts on. So when you think about application development in blockchain, or when you think about someone building an application and let's say they have an idea for an application, they think it may or may not should go on blockchain, or let's say it's an enterprise company thinking about rolling out a pilot. I find, and I believe that if we look at adoption, it's been pretty slow. What are your thoughts? I mean, just yes or no, or am I crazy? Would you say adoption's faster than you expected in blockchain, or slower, or about right there?
No, it's way slower than it should have been.
All right. So, okay. And I agree. So if we take that premise, right, I tend to talk to like various enterprises, whoever, right, where I'm kind of looking at between why. And in one hand, I see all of these platforms, right, where I think for the last 2 years have put their resources or try to put their resources with companies who at scale, so let's just say enterprises, could be supply chain or distributor or bank or whoever, where they kind of started in pilots, let's say 2018 or 2019, and then for a variety of reasons. So maybe the internal evangelist at X company went away, or some enterprise company was late to a coalition that they didn't have control of, right? So their interests weren't at heart. Or that each time, or it was hard to sell internal use cases of blockchain, right? Like they had to go and sell it to upper management, which is, it kind of left with a world where a bunch of platforms were trying to do pilots, a bunch of enterprise companies were trying to work with them on it, and then that kind of phased out, right? So now I'm coming back and looking at it, and what I see is a lot of the platforms, they're disillusioned now. Like they're like, we tried that with X company and Y company, right? So, and then on the other half, you have the enterprises that are like, yeah, we've done some blockchain pilots, but now we want to think about it differently, right? Not as so much of a novelty. I kind of see a lot of enterprise companies kind of just defaulting to Fabric or Hyperledger because of that, right? And so here's my question. And you brought up like CryptoKitties, so I think it's a good example. Right, like when CryptoKitties came out, it crashed, right, or broke Ethereum. Right, so I've always had a question like, what if it wasn't just running on Ethereum? What if CryptoKitties simultaneously was running on Tron, was running on Neo, right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then I kind of look back to like the smartphone market, where, you know, Apple 2007, 2008, 2009, right? Then the App Store came out, and then the Android devices start to come out. The first one's pretty much shit, right? And then it gets a little better. And now Android phones are pretty good. But people were not migrating to them in bulk because when they went to the Play Store versus the App Store, they couldn't find Instagram at first. They couldn't find Fruit Ninja, right? So Google had to start basically paying developers, right, to write their applications for their platform. Now, I think if you look back in the last 10 plus years, there's an explosion of applications on mobile platforms. I don't have the stats in front of me. I would guess it's probably like maybe 20 to 30% of applications on mobile across iOS and Android are probably written natively, right? And then maybe 60, 70% are cross-platform compilers, right? So the Xamarin's, the PhoneGaps, the Corona SDKs, et cetera, or the Unities, where you write the code once, and then when you go to build a file, it will build it for X platform, Y platform. Do you see any future for that in blockchain where people shouldn't necessarily, they should write their applications the same way they're writing their applications? And then when it comes to choosing a blockchain, there's enough similarities. I mean, maybe call it 85% that cover most use cases. And then obviously there's edge cases where, you could have an API, SDK, et cetera, where you just say deploy to blockchain and it kind of fits those parameters. Do you see any future for that in this ecosystem?
Well, the scenario you're describing, it would require these blockchains to share the logic to a large degree. So what the state transition function of these blockchains would have to be almost identical to support the code that needs to be run, and to make sure that the code runs identically across both of those or several of those chains. I don't think several identical chains make sense or will even survive. So any chain that really tries to be another chain but better will die if it doesn't, shift its priorities and add something truly unique to it. That is why we didn't really with Polkadot, we didn't compete with existing chains. We're not competing with existing chains. We're building a bridge for all of these chains to talk to each other, and through that method, what you're talking about becomes possible, because with Polkadot you get all of these. Polkadot has a relay chain at the center which controls all of the other chains that connect to it. It gives them finality and allows them to proceed with their block production. But all of the other chains that connect to this main chain, so these shards, they're heterogeneous, so they can be different from each other, and that's the unique aspect there. These chains can be as different as fire and water. It doesn't matter. They will be able to talk to each other through Polkadot, and that's how you get interoperability between chains while keeping this shared security. You get cross-chain composability without any real sacrifices. And so the Ethereum community admittedly has an enormous development ecosystem. It didn't really bleed over into Web 2.0 as much as everybody wanted it to, but I'm sure it will eventually as the tools mature. But there's, like, for example, there's a lot of money in Bitcoin, and you can't really do anything with Bitcoin, right? So with Polkadot, what you get is the ability to pull Bitcoin into Ethereum's DeFi ecosystem without making trust trade-offs. You don't need a centralized custodian to keep your Bitcoins and to mint your tokens on Ethereum, or somebody to burn your tokens and then to reliably release your Bitcoin. And with that method, you get the scaling approach that you need. So in this scenario, if CryptoKitties came out, CryptoKitties could be a specialized blockchain for kitties that's really, really optimized to process only cat transactions. But the CryptoKitties, the great CryptoKitties network clog was due to the fact that every transaction in the system was being processed by the same people. So it didn't matter which priority you had. So the people who were trying to get their hands on Ether to play CryptoKitties were being processed by the same people already playing CryptoKitties, and these were being processed by the same people who were doing everything else on the chain. So if somebody bought a chewing gum for 50 Gwei somewhere in Africa on Ethereum, that same transaction was processed by the same people who were processing all of the other stuff. And there's no optimization you can squeeze out of this. You can hope that the block size will increase with demand, and it did, but it didn't increase fast enough. And of course, we saw those incredible gas spikes that we had to pay to get even simple transactions through. But if you have an application-specific blockchain that does kitties really, really well, and only kitties, then every kitties player can play on that chain and those transactions will not bother the rest of the chain. Only the final outcome, if you want to pull it out into any other chain or any other system, then will you transmit that message and interact with another chain. But your interactions are encapsulated on that one chain that is still secured by the central relay chain. And that's kind of how you can accomplish this, how you can avoid these problems in the future. Yeah.
So you're telling me it's not easy.
It is not easy.
Yeah, I believe this. I mean, I do. I think there's a general conception that we should have built this feature already, and I don't think people truly understand how hard it is to write an application that is served decentralized manner, timely sync, and at the end of the day, everything balances out. Like, it's more work than people understand. Hey, I feel like we could probably have this conversation for 2 more hours. We probably have about 14 more minutes. And I have to welcome the next guest. But a few of the things, and you kind of hit on them with what, talking a bit about Polkadot. Could you share what's the Web3 vision? Some of the things like mergers of blockchain and Polkadot. Do you mind kind of expanding for the audience a bit what that kind of looks like from your guys' side?
Yeah, sure. So the thing I mentioned at the beginning, like the sending of messages anywhere, anytime to anybody, that's basically what Web 3.0 is. And that's what we want to accomplish with Polkadot. So Polkadot has this main relay chain on which there are validators. It's a proof of stake chain. You can become a validator on this chain, and then you will be producing the blocks. And everybody else who has the DOT tokens will be able to nominate you and earn their kind of share of this validation proceeds through you. Nominators nominators will kind of back a validator to get them higher in the order of validators, and the system is optimized to make sure that the most possible dots are locked in the staking system at any given time to give a lot of economic security to the entire chain. And these chains that connect to the Polkadot relay chain, so these parachains, parallel chains, the relay chain is aware of their runtime. It is aware of what they need to go from block to block, and it will let them do that or not let them do that. So it controls this state transition validation function for them. They will send their block candidates to this relay chain. The relay chain will either say yes or no. And what the big deal about this is that every chain, every chain is as strong as the entire system, because there's one chain with one economic set of tokens locked in the staking system. That chain is giving this shared security to all the connected chains. So you can't really reverse one single chain and make a mess across multiple chains who were depending on data from that chain. That is the vision of Polkadot, basically. This connected chain feature, and these chains, they can be as custom as you want it to be. So if I build, for example, a computer game, and my save file for the computer game says at one point this character has this much gold, these potions, and this armor, and then in another point in time the save game file says now he has this much coins, this many potions, and so on. If I build a function that translates one state of this save file to another state of this file in a way that this Polkadot relay chain can understand, and there are specific rules for that are defined in the specification. If I write it that way, the save point file transitions, then even my game can become a parachain. It doesn't matter that it's not a blockchain. So you don't have to have a blockchain to connect to Polkadot. You have to have this state transition function that is required by Polkadot, and Polkadot will help you secure any application that you connect to it that way. And that's what we're basically building there, a connected web of blockchains that can talk to each other. They can be as unrelated as you want or as similar as you want them to be. Like in the example before, so Ethereum and Bitcoin can basically talk through Polkadot, send messages to each other, and you essentially get the ability to send Bitcoin to Ethereum through this, or these Bitcoin tokens from Ethereum back to Bitcoin. And to test all of this, so it's not just research and ideas. We actually deployed all of this software live last year on the Kusama network, and the Kusama network is like a crazy cousin, like a canary network for Polkadot. It's an experimental network where we deploy all the code first and see how it works. It's not a test net. It has real economic value. People are staking there and earning the tokens for their stake. And all of the features that will end up in Polkadot, plus some extras, are already available and in production in Kusama. For example, you have on-chain governance, where if you want to change the code of the chain itself, you vote for that change in this democratic palette, in this democratic interface. And when this decision is voted on, it will be automatically applied to the chain. And that's another advantage of these of the Polkadot ecosystem. So the company that's building it, Parity, has built a lot of blockchains in the past, right? And they always did it from scratch. Like they built the networking layer, the database layer, all of these layers that they take months when you're building your own blockchain. So they abstracted that away and they built a framework, again, a template that you can build your blockchain on. And this is called Substrate. And if you download Substrate today and you compile it, you basically have a blockchain node. You can share it with your friends. If they connect, if they load it up, and if your nodes find each other, you have a blockchain. And that's done in like 5 minutes after you compile. It's really a piece of cake. And then this node, this template, this framework has the ability, like it lets you build your application logic, your chain specific logic on top of it. And then when you compile that, you have your custom blockchain. And then you can connect that custom blockchain to Polkadot, or in this case to Kusama. So we have this starter kit for everybody. And if somebody wanted to build CryptoKitties for this ecosystem, they can already. And in fact, we do have a tutorial that builds CryptoKitties on Substrate. So you just download this node, you write some code, like 100 lines of Rust code. It's compiled, you deploy it, you send it to people who want to run your node, and suddenly you have a blockchain that powers a dedicated version of the CryptoKitties on this separate blockchain. Yeah, and that's kind of the vision there.
Well, I understand like 40% of what you say, and I'm pretty technical. I imagine like other people can't, and that a lot of other people probably really can understand it. And I only say that as a compliment. Like, so maybe let's, for our last few minutes, like, I want to hear your thoughts on like distilling that down. Like, throw out all your engineering knowledge. Like, if you go out. If you go back maybe 5 years and you go out the next 5 years, not in technical terms, I guess slightly, we require developers to kind of build this feature, right? So there's some precautions they want to take. Obviously, there's like adoption from the public, et cetera, who are probably not going to be technical. What do you kind of see that future looking like? What do you think maybe a few of the mistakes we made in the past are? Do you think we're solving those or stepping into worse mistakes over the next 5 years? And what would you say are the 1, 2, 3 things that if you were the overlord of blockchain that you would implement and that you think would, if you could have the perfect world, what would it look like?
The perfect world. Well, in a perfect world, everybody would be running their own node. It would be trivial and easy to get started with this. You would literally just download a file, click it, and your node would be running. Nobody would be relying on cloud services, and no centralized outage would disrupt anybody's workday or life in any way, because we would all be running decentralized websites and decentralized infrastructure for those websites to read data from. So my ideal world of blockchains is a world where content is stored on IPFS, which is the interplanetary file system, where it is accessed and verified through various blockchains that connect to it, and where everybody is running their own version of this at home. I'm personally running a few nodes at home of different blockchains, and those are running on small, like this yay big devices that spend 6 watts of power. So that's a trivial expenditure of energy and bandwidth for basically infinite access to the world computer. And I think more people should do that. And I think we're not doing enough to forward this adoption aspect that people should really run their own infrastructure in this way. That is one of the things that we also want to accomplish.
And not to interrupt you, but do you see like low powered devices? I mean, if you say 6 watts, or we might consider a cell phone. I mean, do you see those kind of as the future of decentralization? I mean, I do. I imagine every night half of the world is sleeping while the other half is not. And their devices, their phones are plugged into the wall, and they could run you see this in like Boink from Berkeley, or cancer models, right? Where you have kind of what do you call it? When a bear hibernating devices, and what power they can do. Obviously power is always comes to be like the end cost if there's like a cost factor. But do you see low power devices kind of having a future there?
Not as blockchain nodes, no. Not in the current state of blockchain nodes. Blockchain nodes need a really high amount of input-output writes, so they really put some strain on your hard drive. And that hard drive in mobile phones is just a digital card. And that card is going to wear out with thousands of read writes that a blockchain needs per day, that a blockchain node needs per day. Another problem is that GSM connections often do quality of service checks on the packets that your connection is sending. And if that's not video streaming or gaming, it's going to downgrade it because it doesn't see it as kind of a high priority. So you need to mask that traffic or do something with it. And yet another problem is that when a phone hibernates, it breaks all long-lasting connections. So when you come back online, it has to reestablish those and find its peers, other nodes in the network. And that can be problematic because a lot of networks have a reputation score, which basically flags your node, your device, as a bad guy because it disconnects often and doesn't really provide any utility to the network. But low power devices like phones that do go offline often and so on, they can be good hosts for stateless or light nodes. So nodes that don't do actual work on the chain, but do read from the chain. So they can be your gateway to the blockchain data and serve you data from the blockchain. I don't think they're going to be useful in decentralizing the blockchain infrastructure. For that, people are going to have to be running some kind of service on an always-on device, or generally low-power devices like Raspberry Pis and stuff like that. So things you can just plug in and hide behind a closet and forget about, but that still need dedicated access to power and bandwidth.
Got it. Yeah, it's going to be very interesting what happens in the next few years. Something tells me I can't believe that we can't figure this out on like ARM-based devices, etc. And I understand what you're saying on read-write. When you go to like eMCC stuff or solid-state drives, etc. I mean, there's a lot of override of what's going on, right? And even when you think about it in a hardware element, how long could this hardware survive? But hey, we have about 2 minutes here. As I mentioned earlier, I really enjoyed this conversation. I think we should continue. And next week we are forming some additional panels and stuff. I would like to have you on as well. But hey, in the last 2 minutes, what would you tell some of the 19, 20, 21-year-old students in CS degrees right now who are, watching this from like 100 universities and looking for advice about how they want to approach blockchain? But what advice would you give them in a minute or two?
Don't chase money. You can probably make more money being a regular developer if you're really good at it. And I know I did when I was a web developer. Don't chase money, but think about what you're taking for granted and what you have right now. The ability to watch this video and to not be prevented by anybody from seeing this content is something you're taking for granted, and something that a lot of people in the world do not have because they don't have the infrastructure or they don't have the permission of an entity that is above them. Don't take things for granted, basically. Think about what you can do to improve this infrastructure and to make the world more decentralized. You're not helping information disseminate throughout the world if you're hosting everything you do on Amazon Web Services. You are helping if you help other people develop their own services and if you run the infrastructure yourself. So I would say dive in deep into why we are doing what we're doing. Try and see that you can lose everything you've been taking for granted at the drop of a hat if something goes wrong at the highest levels of your government or environment. And just think about how much more resilient you can make the internet at large and how much more decentralized and censorship resistant you can make it through your efforts.
You heard it there, kids. Listen to this guy. I think he's a smart developer. You might want to check him up online, and maybe tweet at him. We'll share some of that info later. And before we leave here, I'll say one last thing. Like, what's always inspired me, like when we started helping colleges, right? It was like, let's make an accelerator. What's a good funnel for talent, early stage talent? Let's help colleges, right? And not in an unselfish way. Just let's help breed blockchain, and then 1, 2, 3 years later, let's see what the outcome was. And I remember being shocked, right? Because it's like, I'm kind of in the industry, and, you know, a lot of my partners or people I deal with, they are, you know, whatever a veteran is in blockchain, say 2, 3, 4, 5 years, you know, there's a lot of pessimism, right? It's like they went through the ICO world, they're like, oh, like scams or this or that. And then you get on the call with like 40, 20-year-old CS majors, and they didn't get scammed in ICOs. Right? So like, they're like, I'm going to build an application and I want it to be on blockchain, or like, why am I not going to build my application on blockchain? So it's something I always try to tell people, because I really do feel like what we do at Mousepell is unique in the fact that we get to talk to so many students. It's like the one thing I'm trying to explain to people. I'm like, I know where the future of blockchain is. It's like, all of these kids who do not know that they can't do it, basically. And they're just like, this is cool, right? Like, yeah, I'm just going to build a decentralized application. And then I'll transition to 30-plus-year-old person who's been in blockchain for, you know, I've seen this project and that project, right? And it's just, there's a beauty in a clean slate, right? And that's, again, appreciate your time here, and I think a lot of people will enjoy this conversation, and you know, we'll love to expand it and even show you more about what's going on, and you know, obviously you have an education focus, so we kind of share that vision, and you know, we won't get anywhere without the smart people to make this thing happen. So as much as we can do to build that, we're all for it. So any last words before we hop off?
Just, you know, explore. Go to kusama.network or polkadot.network. Check out what we have. If you want to start developing, just hop on to substrate.io. There's a bunch of tutorials there. You'll be running your own custom blockchain in 2 hours. Experiment with what's possible, and don't be afraid, and don't think it's only for scams or quick money. Really think about the infrastructure that you're building with this new technology.
It's the future. Some of the links that he just mentioned will be included in this video, and you guys will see them. So just go check out Polkadot. I think read up about Bruno. It's been very nice to talk to you, honestly. I think next week maybe we can even continue the conversation if you have a bit more time.
Sure, I'd love to. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, hey, definitely appreciate your time, and we look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you.